Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith analyzes corn and soybean markets. Rick Rasby discusses cornstalk grazing. Brian Krienke talks about nitrogen applications in soybeans. And Loren Giesler explains how you can identify soybean diseases to better plan for the future. Roy Smith is our market analyst this week. The U.S. harvest is starting slowly, according to the USDA's latest report. As of Sunday, the nation's farmers had harvested 7% of their corn and 3% of their soybeans. Both are behind the 5-year averages, as are state numbers from Nebraska. Farmers here had combined 3% of their corn and only 1% of their soybeans. We started our discussion with Roy Wednesday afternoon by asking for an update on crops in his area of Cass County, Nebraska.
Well, the corn is maturing pretty fast. The soybeans are a little slower. They're dropping leaves, but certainly not ready to harvest by any stretch of the imagination. There's a little bit of corn harvest that's being done for people that can dry, or if they can go directly to an ethanol plant. But basically, I think we're maybe a week away on the beans and probably a little more than that on the corn.
It's humbling to look at the markets now and see where corn and soybeans are, but is there any peace to be had in knowing that maybe the harvest low is near?
Well, it's possible. You know, that I can look at those long-term seasonal charts that I keep and say, well, this year the prices really followed the charts very closely, and for people who believe in them and use them, it's been, I'd say, less of a problem experience. Nobody likes to see prices go down, but at least if you sold some back there when the chart said to sell, you're not in quite such bad shape.
You know, the harvest scare is probably more relevant right now than a frost scare. Could we get anything from a delayed harvest across parts of the country?
Theoretically, it's possible. Usually we don't have any reaction to delayed harvest because people assume that the reason it's delayed is because it's a big harvest, and so one offsets the other. And you know, I guess I could cross my fingers and say there might be, but I doubt it.
Yeah. You don't think it'll move the harvest low then before or after? Because I think your normal spot is October 3.
October 2nd on corn, October 3rd on soybeans, very reliable around that time period. And the thought has crossed my mind that it's possible, since harvest is going to be delayed a little bit, that the harvest low will be delayed a little bit. And you have to remember that this harvest low, even though you look at it on the chart and it looks like, well, there it is, October 2nd, but sometimes there are little variations in it. Like last year, we had a harvest low and then a rally back and then a new harvest low later, about 6 weeks, and then the rally back really took hold. So you kind of get these pictures in your mind from looking at the charts, but the markets don't always do exactly what the charts say exactly at the time.
Tell me where you are on the dead cat bounce right now, tracking in soybeans.
I started tracking soybeans 2nd of September, so we have now about 15 days. You have to have a sustained period of a few days going up before you can have the dead cat bounce. I mean, it's kind of self-fulfilling deal that you can't have the dead cat bounce until you have a bounce, by definition. And so we, as of today, which is the middle of the week, we've had just a couple days higher. Now, we like to see those days higher, but they don't account for much unless we can put at least 10 of them together. And so we watch it, we track it, but don't hang your hat on it until it happens.
How do basis numbers play into that?
Usually the dead cat bounce, a big part of it, especially with soybeans, is the basis improvement. Right now we've got a basis of about 80 under here in the country. Wouldn't surprise me to see it go to 50 under, but it probably won't do that until harvest is over or almost over. So again, watch for it, but don't hang your hat on it until you see something substantial.
Let's talk about selling this new crop. What targets are you looking at for corn or soybeans? Well,
soybeans, always look for at least a minimum of 50 cents off the harvest low. In the last few years, it's been $1, and I guess I'm thinking, you know, you split your crop and sell part of it at 50 cents and sell part of it at 75, and if you get $1, grab it. With corn, it's a little more of gradual improvement in the basis as we go into winter and spring, and we don't usually see that 50 cents up. Usually it's, you know, gradually working its way up into April or May. And so I don't have any actual hard and fast numbers that I look for in corn, except that I like to see the spread, which right now is 28 cents a bushel here in southeast Nebraska. For people who are putting corn in the bin and are willing to take the risk away and hedge it, selling July futures and storing for the basis improvement and for the spread is a pretty reliable strategy in low price years like this.
Any thoughts on next week's USDA report on quarterly grain stocks?
We usually don't get the reaction from that report anywhere nearly as strongly as we get it from the September report. And you know, I would like to think that there might be a positive surprise, but I can't imagine what that would be right now. I think we maybe have to wait till November, December for a positive surprise.
Again, the USDA is scheduled to release its quarterly grain stocks report Tuesday at 11 a.m. Next week, Darren Newsom from DTN will join us to recap those estimates and look at movement in corn and soybean markets. The 2014 harvest is just beginning in Nebraska. When combines finish picking this season's crop, the open ground could provide producers with an additional opportunity to pick up value from those acres. As we've previously told you, UNL research has shown that grazing corn stalks can positively affect the following year's soybean crop. 18 years of UNL research has shown a soybean yield increase of 2 bushels per acre after cows take away some of that corn residue. Earlier this week, we talked with UNL Extension beef specialist Rick Rasby about how to determine the amount of residue in a field and how much should be taken off.
We think that cornstalk residue is an opportunity for cow-calf producers to not only lower feed costs, our annual feed costs, but also corn residue is a pretty good feed resource for beef cattle.
How do you determine how much residue is in a given field?
Well, we've done quite a few experiments, and so we got a pretty good handle on the amount of stem or stalk, cob, and husk and leaf that's left out there based on a bushel of corn. And so when you take a look at it, there's about 18 pounds of stem per bushel of corn, about 5.8 to 6 pounds of cob per bushel of corn, and then about 16 pounds of husk and leaf per bushel of corn. And so we know pretty much how much residue is produced from a bushel of corn.
Once you know that, how do you determine then how many cows you put out there and how long you leave them there?
Yeah, so our recommendation would be to remove half the husk and leaf. So half of that husk and leaf, so that's 16 pounds of husk and leaf per bushel of corn, and we'd recommend grazing about 6 or 8 pounds of husk and leaf. And so we know cattle in cornstalk fields are are selective grazers. Of course, they'll select corn first because it's pretty palatable and pretty nutritious, but they'll not like the stem or the cob, and they'll select the husk and leaf over the stem and the cob, and that's because husk and leaf are fairly palatable, at least more palatable than the cob and the stem, but also they're fairly high in nutrition. And so the idea would be that we'd like to basically target cattle in a crop residue grazing situation to eat the husk and leaf, and of that husk and leaf, remove about half of it.
Now, the crop producer is going to be concerned about probably two things: the effect on subsequent yield and compaction that might ensue from cattle walking out on the dirt or wet dirt.
So to answer the first one question, the compaction, we've done 21 years we haven't seen compaction. And I think that's because during that winter season, as you get warm days, you get cold days, and I think there's enough thawing and heaving that you don't see compaction. The other thing would be is that we understand that we need to add some organic matter back into the soil. And so that's the reason why we wouldn't recommend taking off the cob, wouldn't recommend taking off the stem, but focus that grazing situation on the husk and the leaf.
And then, Rick, what does it show for yield on corn or soybeans after?
You know, that's a question, that's a good question, and a question that we asked many, many years ago, and started collecting yield data on fields that we've grazed and we've basically not grazed. And you know, we've got quite a bit of data, 18 to 21 years of data at one location, about 5 to 6 years of data at another location. And if you go corn soybean rotation, we don't see any depression in yield in the soybeans that following year. We also don't see any depression in the corn yield the year after that. And so we feel that if you graze according to our recommendations, that you'll not see a reduction in subsequent yield of both soybeans and of corn.
Should I ask if there are any extra nutrient requirements to put out along with stocks as cattle are grazing?
You know, our data would say that, you know, if you got spring calving cows and they go out in pretty good body condition, I'm talking about body condition score 5, they'll maintain and maybe even gain a little bit of body condition without supplementation. They'll for sure maintain based on our grazing recommendation. If you've got calves out there, basically it's the amount of what kind of targeted average daily gain do you need or you want to get. And so if you get into that situation, we've got some nice data that you can almost program feed those cattle or those calves out on corn residue. This amount of distillers grains will give you this amount of gain, and so we've got that pretty well pegged as well. So from a supplementation standpoint, it depends if there's cows or if there's calves, and you'd always want to supplement salt and mineral when you're out on crop residue.
Snow or ice a concern?
You know, ice is a bigger concern than snow. You know, cattle will actually go through snow, and in fact I've seen them graze crop residue, especially if that snow's fairly fluffy and not real wet, you know, 6 to 8 inches. But when you start getting ice, it packs that residue back down next to the soil, and it's just difficult for cows to graze that kind of in that kind of situation.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to UNL's Cornstalk Grazing Calculator, which can help producers determine the value of corn stalks. We've recently shown you interviews from one of the 2014 Soybean Management Field Days. The events were sponsored by the Nebraska Soybean Board and give growers updates on research and information about markets and public policy. One of the research areas with UNL Extension over the past years has been nitrogen use in soybeans. UNL Extension soil educator Krienke joined us earlier this week to talk about the ongoing results of those studies. We started by asking about how much nitrogen soybeans use throughout the growing season.
There's quite a bit of variation out there, but I would say on average you can bank around maybe 5.5 pounds of actual nitrogen to contribute to every bushel of soybeans produced. And that can go up as you start to yield higher.
So it needs more as the season goes on then?
Yes. So the uptake for soybeans starts really minimal kind of early in the growing season. It's barely taking up anything, and it starts to increase. And as soon as reproductive stages start, it really ramps up, and it doesn't really stop until physiological maturity.
UNL has been looking at this now for quite a while, I think. What are they looking at?
We're trying to figure out, think of it as different schemes, if you will. There's been a lot of different types of research on nitrogen, and most of it's inconclusive, or there's negative results a lot of the times that are unexplained. And so we're just trying to look at it from different types of logic and say, well, maybe nitrogen still is possible to be a limiting nutrient, that we can kind of exploit that relationship. And so we're trying to look at it from different angles to see if maybe there's something we missed.
Let's look at specifically 2013 data from 4 soybean management field day sites.
Right.
What did that data show?
Okay, that was inconclusive at best. They had looked at different growth stages, so they applied early in the growing season and then later in the reproductive stages in varying amounts, and then of course they had to check. Basically, there was some yield increase with nitrogen, but it was off any kind of reasonable chart for what a farmer would want to be doing. Mm-hmm. It was 400 pounds of nitrogen, 300 pounds of nitrogen to get maybe a couple bushels of benefit. So completely unrealistic for what our producers would want to even consider.
Now at the 2014 site, you asked producers how many of them had used nitrogen in soybeans. What did they say?
Typically I'd get maybe 5%, just a small handful, and most of them I asked, well, you know, what'd you hear about it? And they mostly just curiosity driving them. Some had heard maybe it was beneficial in some instances, particularly high yielding soybeans, and without fail, with the exception of very few, there was no response from what they could see in their fields and their trials.
Does it matter if it's normally an average yielding field or a high yielding field?
Supposedly, past research has shown that it would be the high yielding environments that we'd be interested in looking at applying nitrogen. That's over 50 to 60 bushels per acre of soybeans. But there's nothing in our data so far that shows with any kind of accuracy that we could predict when we'd see a response, or if you should or should not apply nitrogen.
And it doesn't matter the timing of it either then?
We can't seem to nail that down on when timing would be effective. The best thing we can understand, or the latest logic would be, we do know that when you apply nitrogen and the soybeans come in contact, the roots that have nodules, those nodules become stalled. They don't continue to grow while the soybean plant is taking up nitrogen. And so after that nitrogen has been utilized by the plant, the nodules start growing again. Well, what does that mean? It means lost time that those nodules could have been growing and becoming bigger scrubbers, if you will, of nitrogen. So we thought, what could we do that mimics what already is occurring, which is the soil is giving up nitrogen through mineralization. Can we mimic that slow release by putting a slow release fertilizer on? And so that's 2014, that's what we're looking at. Anybody's guess right now of what we're going to see. You cannot see treatment effects visually right now if you look at the field.
In the end then, going back to 2013 and data before that, is there a clear recommendation of to apply or not to apply?
No clear recommendation to ever say apply. Okay. I would never be comfortable based on what I've seen. There have been instances, yes, where there is yield increase, and so I don't want to discourage producers doing some on-farm research, and if they must, contact our on-farm research. They'll help you set up a proper treatment on how to detect and whether or not you're actually getting a benefit from that. But the best way is to experiment on your own. But I would say I am not confident that we could actually accurately predict with any certainty whether there will be a response or not. And most times I would say there's no response.
Data from the 2014 Soybean Management Field Day studies will be available for growers by January 1st. If you are interested in doing on-farm research, we'll link to information about that program on the Market Journal website. The Nebraska farmer says monitoring the condition of your rangeland just got easier as a result of a new mobile app called GrassSnap. You can learn how it works in the magazine's September issue. The new app, which was developed by UNL Extension educator Bethany Johnston, takes ranchers through several monitoring steps using photographs to identify changes in grassland health. The app is available for smartphones and tablets on both Apple and Android operating systems, and it's free thanks to support from the Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition. You can read more about the GrassSnap app in the September Nebraska Farmer. As we mentioned at the start of the show, Nebraska's farmers are on the front end of their soybean harvest, but many fields still feature green plants, especially in replanted areas. UNL Extension plant pathologist Loren Giesler says identifying problems at this point in the growing season can still be helpful in planning for the future.
So we're at a time of year where a lot of our soybean harvest is going on or is going to happen here pretty quick. And one thing that's key as you're looking at your plan for next year is making sure you identified any of your problems correctly in the field. We do still have some fields with some green tissues out there yet, so there's still that last chance with identification of any problems in your field. One of the things that makes our U.S. soybean crop really strong, and here in Nebraska and across the U.S., is the fact that we have our land-grant universities really out there looking for new problems. Now, we can't get to all the acres out there, but the great thing is there's a lot of tremendous scouting going on with our crop consultant industry and individual farmers and professional ag managers out there. And so when they see a unique problem or something different, many times they'll bring that to our attention, and then that's how we will identify those new and emerging threats to our soybean crop. So if you have something that you've seen in your field that you don't know what it is, and you talk to a local person, they can't identify it, really encourage you to bring that in and make sure we identify it correctly. You know, that's how all the new things that have occurred now have been identified in the past, and so there's always still room for something that we don't know exists to be out there. The other thing is, I just want to really encourage you here in these last few weeks that we're into maturity and ending up, that you have identified those things correctly so you can make those variety selections in the future and when you're planning out things starting this fall. You know, this year we had a lot of sudden death syndrome, we had Phytophthora, and we had a lot of bacterial blight early on, and then in some parts of the state more frog eye leaf spot. So if you've had some of these problems specifically, not as much on the bacterial side, but the other fungal problems, you can do some variety selection when you're looking at the seed books this fall and making those selections that way. So if you've had a problem in the field and you're trying to identify it, if we still have green leaves and green plants, it's easy to send that in. It is difficult to identify one of those plants when it's already dead, the leaf tissues are gone, because we find many other fungal organisms that will colonize those dead plants in the event that something else killed it even a week or two ago. Now, one exception to this when we're looking at plants that are completely senescent would be white mold. In some parts of the states we did see white mold this year, and in those, even the mature plants, the dead stems, we'll see those really bleached and white in color. So if you're harvesting and you haven't identified that, and you're seeing pockets where you have low yields, if you, even after you cut, you can see those stems will be really bleached and white in those areas, and you'll find those sclerotia in the stems. So that would be the main exception if we've got a dead, completely senescent plant. Otherwise, those still leaves, stems, if you have pockets in the field where you see plants staying green, many times this time of year we'll have viral issues that will keep those plants green along field edges or along grassy areas. So again, I think we had a great production season, and hopefully you're going to do even better in the future if you've had some of these disease problems.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to information about submitting samples to UNL's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Clinic. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this past week, of course, the thing we dealt with was that upper air low that ejected out of the central Rockies, slowly moved across the state and kind of weakened as it moved to the east of us, almost played out exactly as the models projected last week. Heaviest precipitation fell across the central part of the state, and we had some isolated pockets in southeastern, extreme southeastern Nebraska where more than an inch of rainfall was reported. So as the system passed to our east, now we're starting to get some of the warmer air building in. It did start to occur a little bit earlier in western Nebraska, but everybody is just sharing in the wealth of these warmer than normal temperatures. We expect that to hold for much of this weekend before we turn our attention to another system coming into the middle of next week that has the potential, as it passes, to start to pull in some colder air from Canada, and it would not be shocked whatsoever based on what I'm seeing from the models that a hard freeze will occur sometime next weekend through the early part of the following week for a substantial portion of the western central corn belt. So let's get to look at the upper air models and see what we can expect as we go through this period. Here's this big upper air low that is going to slowly make its way eastward. We have this ridge in place that is bringing the warmth for today. There is a little residual mid-level low in the upper atmosphere that may cause a few sprinkles in portions of Iowa and Minnesota. Some of that may touch extreme northeastern Nebraska, but I would not account on anything more than just trace type precipitation. But the big news will be the slow movement of this system as it progresses toward the east. By tomorrow, we'll see that system just kind of sitting there. We still have the ridging in place. Another nice warm day. Everybody should be well into the 80s, with the exception of western Nebraska, where 90s are probably going to be very common. And as we get into Monday, we'll start to see the system lifting out. So we'll start to see some shower activity developing, particularly across the Panhandle during the second half of the day. And that may spread during the overnight hours into central Nebraska. And by the time we get into Tuesday, the system starts to move up into central South Dakota, and we should see a fairly fairly widespread area showers and thunderstorms across the state. The heaviest precipitation right now is being projected for central and south central Nebraska, with lighter amounts both in eastern and western Nebraska. As we go into Wednesday, this system starts to weaken as it moves up into the upper plains region, but we start to see a broad general troughing pattern taking place, so the potential for cooler air starts to slip into northern Nebraska, and we do have a few waves that are going to move right along this periphery that could generate some shower activity, particularly as we get into Thursday. As we get one piece of energy rolling through, that'll once again generate shower activity, and then more importantly, as we get into Friday, we start to see another trough making its way in, and this one does not look to cut off. It looks like it's going to progress on an easterly fashion, and with that, it's going to start to pull down some colder air into our region. Particularly as we get into the Saturday to Sunday time frame, we'll just have to wait to see whether it verifies, but for the last 5 days the models have been pointing to freezing conditions invading North Dakota, South Dakota, and points eastward. The last 2 days we started to pull that cold air well into Nebraska, so it does look like a hard freeze is most likely. Now as we look at the temperature forecast for this 7-day period, you'll notice that very nice conditions there in the first half of the week with a slow cooling trend as we get to the midweek period. We get those thunderstorms and shower activity on Tuesday and Wednesday before we start to see much cooler weather move in the state on Thursday and Friday. As we look at the 8 to 14-day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday, after that low passes through, another low starts to form over the Central Rockies, so colder than normal conditions. In terms of precipitation, we're looking at a large expansive area of above normal moisture to start out the first full week of October.
Thanks, Al. Today's information on corn and soybean markets, grazing corn stalks, nitrogen use in soybeans, and identifying soybean diseases can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. You can also keep up with Market Journal throughout the week on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Next week, Darren Newsom will be our corn and soybean market analyst, and Kate Brooks will look at current cattle and hog inventories. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
A diesel-powered engine on a farm works hard and operates in a grueling environment. Soy biodiesel fuels stand up to the challenge of powering farm equipment, but are also renewable and environmentally responsible as well. The Nebraska Soybean Board is committed to encouraging the use of soy biodiesel to protect the environment and sustain Nebraska's agriculture. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.